Welcome back live. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Mythicist Milwaukee show. Keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. I'm your host, Rob Moore, the Deacon of Doubt. With me as always, well, not always, he was gone last week, but he's back. He is the Imam of Incertitude, Brian Edward. What's going on, Brian?
No, I'm excited to talk to Ken Humphreys.
You are a well-named Imam, for it's true, and we may as well all admit it, you are lacking in certitude.
I am the Imam of Incertitude.
And being the Deacon of Doubt, of course, doesn't mean that I doubt everything. It means that I only inspired doubt. But anyway.
Can I say hello at this point?
Hey, listen, man. Stealing our thunder. There he is. He's Ken Humphreys from England. How are you this evening, Ken?
I'm pretty good. I'm waking up again, having nodded off waiting for your call, but I'm awake now, so ready to roll.
Oh, that or you sleep in very late. I think it's like 8 o'clock there?
It's 8 o'clock here, yep.
Okay, that would have been a long night if you just woke up.
He's nodded off after his tea, and he's been reawoken for a guest shot on the Mythicist Milwaukee show here from downtown Milwaukee, where it's 58 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know, what is that, 17, 18 maybe, Celsius? Not really sure, but what kind of describe the weather here as we approach Christmas for us? Paint a picture of your tiny town in England. Where are you calling from? What's it like tonight?
Well, I'm calling from the south coast of England, and just these last few weeks we've had quite mild weather for this time of year, still in double digits, so really quite unusual. And I guess it's the more pleasant side to global warming that the weather's mild. I don't know what the consequence would be. More storms, probably.
Yes, well, we won't live to see the terrible effects, so we can enjoy the weather. Change in the weather. It's no different here. It's really unseasonably warm, and as we approach Christmas, we turn to a favorite of yours, the Gospels. I was just looking at, and you want to start us off, Brian, and ask a question of mythicist extraordinaire Ken Humphreys as relates to Christmas here as we head towards the solstice.
Right, yeah. Christmas itself, I mean, everybody knows what it is. But if we translate it back, I mean, in 1700s, it may have been somewhat the same as it is now. But what if we trace it all the way back? You know, what are the origins of Christmas? When does it first start? Like, when does it appear in the literature?
When does Christmas appear in the literature? I guess the best answer to that would be sometime during the 4th century.
Wow.
That would be the honest truth. Sometime during the 4th century, the idea of Christmas, in the sense Christ Mass or the Feast of the Nativity as an official event, is quite late in the day. I mean, Christians are under a misapprehension if they think the early Christians celebrated Christmas. Far from it. In fact, some of the early Christian fathers condemned the idea of celebrating birthdays at all.
Wow.
When they drew up their lists, their chronologies of their holy men and their saints, what mattered was the actual day of their death, or as they would always call it, their martyrdom. Mm-hmm. So it was the death day that they marked, and not the vanity of the day of birth. So in that early couple of centuries, there was no question of a Christmas. But of course, the rest of the world was enjoying itself with a midwinter festival. But that's a different thing. Christmas is, of course, a Christian festival, but it began in the 4th century when they officially sanctioned a feast of the Nativity.
Wow, yeah, that's very interesting because with saints, we do celebrate their feast days on their deaths in the Catholic Church, and this makes sense. Who are the church fathers that are arguing against birthdays, that are saying that isn't the way to go?
Well, let me think. One of the nicest quotes is I think from Origen, the church father from North Africa, who said it was sinners, not saints, who celebrated birthday, and that was in the mid-3rd century. So here's a quote from a church father, basically saying, we do not celebrate birthdays. That's a human vanity. and of course, why would they celebrate the birthday of Jesus? I mean, interestingly enough, if we're going to just follow the story through, when the story of Jesus started to circulate, it was as a grown man. This is the Gospel of Mark. We are dealing with a grown man. There is no nativity in the Gospel of Mark. So if there is no birth sequence, how could there be a celebration of his birthday? That came later. How much later, we can talk about that, because obviously the nativity appears in the Gospels of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. Different stories, of course, but there is the nativity. So at least from that point on, it made it, in theory at least, possible to celebrate a birthday, but it didn't actually happen. It didn't happen for another couple of centuries.
Right, but it's interesting. Do other cultures then celebrate birthdays? Because in the Gospel they reference the three kings, bringing gifts. Is that a tradition? I mean, that almost sounds like a celebration, or does that mean something else?
Well, that is an important part of if you like, the genesis of Christmas. The three kings become the center of a feast of adoration, or the Epiphany, as it's sometimes called, an event which, if you like, there was a celebration to mark the arrival of deity into the world, the appearance of God in an earthly guise. And what form did that take? Well, you could identify a number of stories if you take the Gospels as your only source, right? The stories would be of his baptism. There was when God announces, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." So there is an endorsement of Jesus at that point as a man. So we have his arrival there. But then when we invent the idea of the nativity, we can then introduce the idea of the Gentiles, not the Jews, but the Gentiles paying homage to this God. And this is they are presented as the Magi from the East bringing gifts. So here we have the basis for a celebration, and indeed that is the celebration that marked in the Eastern Empire, in the Greek Church, the festival of the Epiphany, the appearance of the divine figure. Now, there is no separate nativity there. It doesn't exist. There is no feast in the nativity in that festival, and it's being held, what we would regard later in the day, it's being held in January. January the 6th is typically the date, held later, and it combines the whole idea of birth, adoration from the Magi, and baptism all in one go. It's one big festival. And I suppose what we should appreciate is, of course, the church, as it evolved, developed its festivals. They didn't all come out in one great swoop, like a box being opened and all the festivals in place. They had to be invented by men over the course of time. And so what eventually happened is this festival of the Epiphany got split into two separate feasts, one being of the Nativity, the other being of the Epiphany. So, one became two, and so now the church calendar begins to fill up at this point. But bear in mind, for early Christians, this whole notion of the birth and so on is secondary to the resurrection. It's all really about the death and resurrection. That's their central message. It's only fairly late in the day they get caught up on this secondary festival of the birth. But of course, in today's world, I'd say across the world, almost universally, Christmas has overtaken Easter as the major festival.
Now, how influential was the need to assimilate those solstice festivals of conquered cultures into the Christian Christmas? Or did Christian Christmas, or do you think, generate more organically on its own?
Well, it works from its own legends. That much is true. It works from its own legends as to develop these various feast days and saints' days and parades. I mean, they were very fond in the early days of parades. You retrace the steps of some holy man, some biblical character. You retrace his steps in some parade on what is the date selected to commemorate that event. This is how it all begins: marching about, sometimes carrying flowers, sometimes carrying candles, whatever. Then, of course, it lives in a world of a successful, vibrant paganism. This is, Christianity doesn't sweep across the world as much as its practitioners like to think it did. It is a minority cult existing in the shadows, and it has to wait for its big opportunity, which is presented by Roman politics and the power struggles in Rome. That gives Christianity its big opportunity. Until then, it's a minor cult, and the big pagan festivals obviously still go on attracting the thousands and thousands of people that they did. And it must have peeved the Christian leaders and evangelicals quite a bit that this is what the pagans were doing. They were ignoring their holy man and going off to what they had always done. And, we all know about how corporations compete. Christianity competed with the competition by borrowing a lot of its practices and copying its tricks, and most notably, putting its own festivals on top of the ones that the pagans had before them. So we all know, I think it's a fairly widely known fact that, that December the 25th was already a celebratory day in Rome when the Christians came along and managed to work out, well, that's just precisely when Jesus was born.
It's nice when things have perfect coincidences like that. I enjoy that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, are you talking about
a lovely coincidence?
Talking about Saturnalia? Is that the festival you're talking about? And tell us more.
Well, what I find the interesting is how the church won't admit, the pagans had a very successful celebration called Saturnalia in Rome, and it climaxed on December the 25th. So we stuck our festival there to grab the crowd. They won't admit that, but what they do, they have their own little logic train to try and get there. And if I can remember it correctly, at this time of night, we have the announcement to the priest Zachary about the birth of his son John, and then 6 months later there's the annunciation to Mary, and therefore from what time that Zachary was working in the temple we can work out when John would have been born and Jesus would have been born 6 months later, and lo and behold we arrive at a birth in December. So they have that little train of logic to sort of paper over the truth, which the truth is, hey, these pagans have a wonderful festival going on here. We're going to have to compete with it head to head. And so they moved in on that particular date. Of course, it didn't really cut much ice until they had the state behind them. Mm-hmm. Once Christianity got endorsed as the favoured religion of the imperial household, of course, the game was changed. They then had all the trump cards, and they could progressively pull the rug from underneath the polytheistic religions, which they did, with all the dedication and enthusiasm that we today see the practitioners of the Islamic State destroying the wonderful ruins of Roman cities in the areas of their control. Let's go and destroy the competition. So it's a time-honoured religious practice to just not mess around. Let's just knock them out of existence. Then everyone will believe what we say.
Right. So if I'm a literate merchant living in 150 AD in Greece, and maybe I've read Luke or Matthew, I'm not celebrating Christmas. I celebrate only the death and resurrection of Jesus. And what other cultural norms do I have? I mean, I don't celebrate my birthday?
Well, that's an interesting thing. When it comes to birthdays, the Romans clearly did celebrate birthdays. The Romans did. Whether a Christian decided not to, well, maybe they did. That was, if they listened to the church fathers and thought it was sinful, maybe they did stop celebrating their own birthday. In the same way that some of them probably observed the rule they should stop cutting their beards, so they grew their beards.
Mm-hmm.
But you should talk about birthdays. There's clear evidence of birthdays. You've obviously heard of Hadrian's Wall, and on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, there's a very interesting fort that the Romans built during the time of Hadrian, Vindolanda, and at Vindolanda, in a rubbish dump, they found a lot of Roman correspondence written on wax tablets. And one of them is an invitation from one Roman officer's wife to another Roman officer's wife saying, come to my birthday. So, there's clear evidence that the Romans enjoyed birthdays like normal people, but whether the Christians decided that was a bad thing, some of them may well have done.
He's Ken Humphreys calling us from England tonight. It's the Mythicist Milwaukee show. Ken is the author of the book, Jesus Never Existed, and now an introduction to the ultimate heresy, available for your pleasure. Take us to the story of the Blessed Virgin from your research. Who is Epiphanius of Salamis, and when did he think Jesus was born?
The Blessed Virgin. What can we say about the Blessed Virgin? I mean, that's again, most of these things that we find in Christianity have a precedent in an earlier cultural archetype. Take the virgin goddess of Athens, for example, Athena. There's a virgin goddess, a protector goddess. The idea of virginity and being a virgin and a god, and yet a mother goddess at the same time, though it sort of doesn't square logically, was quite well established. So so there's nothing unusual there. And Mary, of course, very much modelled on someone like Artemis down in Roman Asia. Very successful cult there. She gets a lot of foliage copied from goddesses like Artemis and Vesta and Athena and so on. There's lovely iconic material, particularly from Egypt, which shows the mother goddess and child, except of course it isn't Mary and the boy Jesus, but it's Isis and her little son Horus. So it is clear evidence of recycling a well-established motif, which obviously fits in with human cultural needs. In a society made up of men and women, it's very useful to have a mother goddess who's raising and caring for a child. So the archetype is there, and why did the Christians, why were they fussed about it? After all, their story's surely about Jesus, isn't so much about Mary, is it? Mm-hmm. Mary doesn't figure too much in the Gospels. She's really got just a walk-on part. She gets inflated in subsequent years because it's useful to the Christian church to displace other established goddesses and their cults, which were lucrative centers of commerce and wealth. And, this really fell into the hands of the church. It was a very shrewd move. We've got everything you've got, therefore you move over to our show. And that's the way it went over the course of centuries. Very tragic, because the one thing that differentiated the Christian empire from the polytheistic empire that went before it is the move from tolerance, pagan tolerance, many paths to the divine, to intolerance. The only way is Holy Mother Church, and if you step out of line, you will suffer for it, usually by being, destroyed. I mean, that is the tragedy of it. Otherwise, it would be quite amusing and entertaining to follow the story.
Yeah, that sounds very capitalistic. They want to establish a monopoly on the worship. People are going to worship, and if you only have one place to do it, yes, you're going to get the tithes, you're going to get the money.
Sadly, that is true. I get individual Christians that you might meet today, I'm sure, can be extremely tolerant and really quite happy that their neighbours have different faiths or no faiths. You know, on an individual level, today's Christians might well do that. But those early Christians, like early members of the Taliban, you know, were extreme. You know, they had all the extremities of enthusiasts and new converts. They had suddenly, as they saw it, been given the truth. And by God, were they going to force it down everybody else's throat? And we still live with the consequences of that. You know, and it's an ongoing battle. That's why I spend my time battling this nonsense.
It's funny. I feel like my identity is being changed because I feel like I was raised a moderate Christian, but you're telling me that, you know, I'm celebrating my birthday as a pagan and I'm generally tolerant of other religions. So this is another pagan. If I was really a pagan, I'm having to reform this. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ancient world was notable for its polytheistic tolerance. I mean, they were extremely superstitious. You know, the gods were everywhere. Nobody doubted that there were gods everywhere. There were gods under bushes and behind trees and just about everywhere. And you could put curses on people and so on. Right. There were probably very few atheists in the ancient world. Mm-hmm. A few intellectual scientists and early thinkers possibly had reached the conclusion that gods didn't really exist. But most other people were fearful of the gods. But therefore, if you are certain that gods are everywhere, you don't want to offend any of them, do you? You know, you're not going to go and burn down a church. It might be a god who will do some harm to you. So you tolerated other faiths, and people did. It's rather like buying different lottery tickets. People would worship at various shrines. I was struck a year or so ago. I was in Corinth, you know, the ancient city of Corinth. And it's rather nice. Around the town square of ancient Corinth, you see what are the remains of all the different what's the word for a moment? All the different temples,
shrines,
all the different temples of the different cults, right? And so you can go along and you can imagine an ancient citizen of the city. He gives a few coins in the temple of Dionysus, and he goes into the temple next door to Artemis, and he goes into the imperial cult shrine next door, and so on. And you could go around 8 or 9 different temples, you know, within a 15-minute walk, and you did that as a way of ensuring that they were all on your side, or at least as many of them as you could get. So that the polytheism was just an essential element of the ancient world. Now, why were the Christians different? Why didn't the Christians just come along and say, well, we've got a new variant, he's slightly different than the others, you know, he's a bit cleverer or he's a bit stronger or something. But, you know, why didn't they do that? Well, where did they come from? They emerged from Judaism. And the one thing about Judaism was its intolerance.
Okay. So they're inherent in some of it.
Stop a phone there. The one thing about Judaism was that it saw itself as the chosen people and its God as the only God, the only permissible God. Once they got rid of their early idea that there might be several gods, but their God was the most important of them, they eventually moved out the idea only one God, and therefore and only one people chosen by God. Now the Christians emerged from them, claiming to be the new Israel. So the one thing they brought over from Judaism was that idea of intolerance. Yeah, that idea that, you know, we cannot tolerate. Our God will be very upset and angry if we tolerate all these false gods.
Right, it's a commandment.
He requires us to silence them.
Yes, it's the first commandment. Right, it's right there. It's right there. You're right. Number 1.
And it resonates today because that's what's missing again from even though we live in a pluralistic society, that sense of the other guy's God is real because he believes in him, and when he dies, he's going to go to him because that God's going to accept him as one of his faithful or her faithful is gone from Western religion anyway, from our perspective, and sadly so. It's kind of a false sense of religious freedom, I think, that we get from that kind of intolerance. Don't you agree?
Yes, it's a worrying and sad thing, and I'm not suggesting today that individual Jews are intolerant. I'm sure they're a very tolerant people by and large. They keep their head down and their nose clean. But, historically, well, it's as you say, it's written there in the commandments. It's there. They are a chosen people. They have been told that they should become a nation of priests. That they, others, that the Gentiles shall come to them and worship at their temple. Not that we'll all go to each other's temples. Oh no, they will come to our temple. I mean, this is how they saw things, and unfortunately, it's one of the aspects that rubbed off on Christianity. Yeah. Interestingly enough, all the other intolerances, many of them, they were willing to waive. You could still do nasty things. Well, God will forgive that. You could murder a few people. No, you'll still be acceptable to the church if you beg for forgiveness and so on. They accepted the rascals into the church, but the idea that you will tolerate somebody else's God, now that is really bad.
Right. Does this intolerance in Judaism, and right, we're not blaming current Judaism. We're talking about Judaism, in the first century. Specifically, the temple is destroyed in that 67 to 70 range. Is this religious intolerance what sparks the war, or is the war more political?
Well, it's clear that the Jews were not of one mind. I mean, it's often spoken as if they move like one collective group, one mind. Many Jews actually became, Romanized. There is no question about that. They went to the Roman theaters and gladiatorial contests. They went to the baths. Herod. Some people might claim he's not really a Jew, but Herod, adopted Roman culture, Roman Greek culture wholesale. So, and many Jews embraced it. What we're talking about is those who would not. Now, in our own time, we have the visible evidence almost on a daily basis of people who basically are saying to everyone else, you're all wrong, and we're going to damn well prove you're all wrong because we're going to blow you off the face of the planet. We know what religious extremism is all about. And unfortunately, the Jews, in attempting to throw off the Roman occupation, which basically every other nation in the Mediterranean had accepted Roman domination, but with the benefits it brought, a certain section of the Jews were not going to have that, and of course they brought ruin on the nation. They brought destruction of the nation, and what comes out of that? Well, no doubt some of them, in despair, became polytheists, but others were absolutely obdurate that they'd simply misinterpreted the divine prophecies, and that now, they've really got the real angle on it now, and this is it became part of the climate out of which we got Christianity emerged. So it's this strange creature that has come from a Judaism with a bloody nose, and it's got aspects that are really unfortunate, and okay, in the course of centuries, some of them it's dropped, but most Christians nowadays fall over themselves to accommodate other faiths. But in that early period, they had that terrifying enthusiasm of new converts.
Sure, and if I'm a Jew in 70 AD and I've survived the war, but my temple is destroyed, I really can't practice the religion the way I used to. So I may very well be a convert to Christianity, which kind of allows me to pull into this, and now I don't need the temple. Does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that is the narrative that the Christians peddle. The narrative how the Jews were rejected by God. They didn't blame the Romans. They didn't say the Romans came along and smashed you. They said the Jews brought it upon themselves because they had rejected Christ. So they were able to take a geopolitical occurrence the Romans smashing Jewish nationalism and turn it into vindication of their own claims that the Christ had come, but the Jews had neglected him, and therefore God punished them. So they could write their story on top of real history. Their story, and then of course, they could keep the Jews around as visible evidence that of their fate and the proof, therefore, of their own gospels. The poor polytheists were just wiped out, but a few Jews were kept around.
It is amazing, and Judaism then survives. Is there a diaspora at that time? Do many Jews leave Israel and take up in other parts of the Roman Empire?
Well, the Jewish the diaspora is often exaggerated. There are vast claims made for you will often read in books that should know better that the Jews were basically everywhere, huge communities all over Europe, and you'll see maps showing Jewish communities everywhere. It's largely exaggerated. I mean, you take the classic example of what happened to the Jews after the destruction of Israel, after not just the first Jewish war of 70 AD, but after Hadrian in 135 really had enough of the Jews and their rebellions and wiped Judea off the map, right? And it became part of Syria, right? It was now part of Syria. The Jews were forbidden to go into what had been Jerusalem, and Hadrian eventually rebuilt it as under a new name, Aelia Capitolina. He rebuilt the city. It was no longer a Jewish city. Now, I'm losing the train of where we were going with this. What were we saying that the
the part of the narrative that Christianity pulls Judaism and the diaspora. So it probably sounds like there were plenty of Jews in Spain and Rome, and they might have thought the ones in Israel that are acting up are radicals.
The Jewish diaspora. Yeah, sorry. The point I was aiming at there was the fact that there is absolutely no evidence that the Jews were shifted wholesale out of that area into other parts of Europe, of the Roman Empire. The implication is the Jews were dispersed, and you hear the word the dispersion, and of course, and today, of course, they talk in terms of the ingathering, the return, and all the rest of it. But in actual fact, the logistics of moving a whole nation away just doesn't stack up. If it had occurred, there would have been historical evidence of it. The only evidence I've found of Jews in any numbers being sent anywhere during that period is when Nero was building the Corinth Canal, and Vespasian, who was one of his generals at the time and was not in terribly good favour, he thought he would buy a bit more patronage from Nero by sending him, I think it was maybe even 10,000 Jewish slaves to Corinth to help build the canal. And we had a Jewish community in Corinth. That does not establish that we have Jewish communities everywhere. Now, yes, they were a trading nation, and they became ever more so after they lost their temple economy. And there is the basis in these communities that did exist, a natural recruiting ground for the new Christian zealots. And we might even compare it, and I mean, it's nice that we do have this example. We might even compare it today with Muslim communities in European cities are a breeding ground for religious zealots. Because if these are the people who don't have work, don't have money, are in the poorest areas, and they hear this message telling them, of favourable times if they do X, Y, and Z, then, this is where Christianity could build up its core base.
So more of a natural emigration than a magical diaspora. The diaspora proved a myth here, too, on the Mythicist Milwaukee show. You heard it, Ken Humphreys from England. I want to remind everybody to go to the website, mythicistmilwaukee.com, and buy a membership. If you like what we do, you can help support by choosing one of a couple of different options for membership in the group, and we also have a Patreon page. You go to Patreon and patronize it, pledge per show, per time period, whatever you can helps support the cause, bringing great guests like Ken Humphreys to the show, and as always, tweet us live at Mythicist MKE during the show to ask a question, talking about Christmas, the Christmas tradition, and as it relates to early Christianity. It's easy for Christians not knowing much about the mythologies that predated and mirrored the Judeo-Christian arc and the Christ mythology to dismiss those earlier mythologies because they haven't heard of them. But everyone's heard of Buddhism and Islam and contemporary religions that survive today. What are some of the parallels between the birth of Jesus as we approach Christmas here and the birth of the Buddha? You know anything about that?
If that's the question, I mean, surely it's a reasonable one to ask, and many parallels have been established between the two. Now, I'm a mythicist, but I'm not somebody who's particularly taken up with the idea of parallel mania, which is easy to do, easy the list of things and therefore argue with QED, one's come from the other. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. If we take another saviour figure, one I'm particularly fond of, the Lord Mithras. Now, there are many parallels between Mithraism and Christianity. He wasn't crucified. That's not true. He wasn't crucified. And in most accounts, he wasn't born from a virgin. He was born from the rock. So he's a rock born. But nonetheless, there is iconography of Mithra where he's actually being born from a rock that is actually an egg, the egg of the primordial world. So he is born, and there is also a sacrifice. Not a sacrifice of himself. He doesn't get himself strung up on a cross like Jesus, but the sacrifice is of the primordial bull. So blood is spilt. It's not his blood, it's the bull's blood, but nonetheless it serves the purpose of saving humanity. So there are parallels there, as long as we don't overdraw them or do it in a crude fashion. So that and what I like to point out about Mithraism is actually, when you ask that simple question, so in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, when we're looking at supposedly the spread of this Christian religion spontaneously by its sheer popularity and the truth of its message, when we look for evidence of that religion, we do not find Christian churches. The earliest churches, belong in no earlier than the 4th century in nearly every European country. They do not exist before that. The earliest one we know of, I think, used to be, if it's still there, just south of Damascus. And it wasn't even a Catholic church. It was a church of the Marcionite branch or sectarians of within the Christian family of faith. So they were sectarians, and that is the earliest church we know of. We don't find lots of churches. Well, what's that got to do with Mithraism? Well, the point is, from that period, from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we find across Europe, from Syria all the way to Scotland, we find Mithraeums. In other words, the chapels of the Mithraists. And there are hundreds of them. We know of about 500 of them, all the way across the Roman Empire. So on the one hand, we have no evidence of Christian churches, and on the other hand, we have plenty of evidence of Mithraic churches. Now, what has happened here? Well, if you go to some of these Mithraeums, you find that there is a Christian church built on top of it. It has actually served the purpose of preserving it. But what it shows is when the Christians became triumphant, when they became the top dogs, the first thing they did was to destroy the competition. And in many cases, they built their own churches on top of an established Mithraic chapel. Now, there is a clear evidence of a domineering trend within Christianity to simply push out of existence its competition. And the competition was in many ways nicer than what it was itself, because the Mithraists were, although they were monotheistic in one sense, they were tolerant of other faiths. And if you go to somewhere like the Museum of London, you'll see how Mithra was worshipped alongside other Roman deities. The other Roman sun gods, other Roman deities. So there was an acceptance which was again purged from the human psyche by the Christian Church.
Is that also true for St. Peter's in the Vatican? Is that built on a Mithrian church?
Oh, it's almost certainly built on something far grander than that. It's one part of it, at least, is built over a pagan cemetery, and which proves very useful if you want to find saints' bones. You can just dig below St. Peter's. Oh, glory! We've found the bones of a saint.
And now they do a first-class relic.
That's great. I never thought of that.
No, what about the last?
Sorry.
What about the Last Supper? Does Mithraism have this, and is this also incorporated?
Oh yes, yes. You must have seen the iconography. That is one of the things we lack from Mithraism is its holy books, because obviously the Christians weren't going to let them survive. But what we do have is a massive quantity of their iconography, and that includes quite a number of copies of the holy banquet that Mithra had with his followers, his 12 followers, who sat round at a banquet, and they wore there were various ranks within the Mithraic chapel. I think 7 of them in actual fact, and they each had a particular role, and they had a sacred banquet which they shared with the god Mithras, and he shared it with also his fellow sun god Sol, and Sol used his chariot to take Mithra after the meal. He took Mithra back up to heaven. So he disappears through the sky, and you see him in his chariot being taken up to heaven, an image that you will find used later for Jesus going in his chariot up to heaven. So you see how they've come along, they've borrowed the iconography along with all the best stories. They're not in the least bit reserved in borrowing a good story. If it worked for the polytheists, it'll work for us, and they just revamped it. So
right.
Yes, that banquet scene is very famous and easy enough to find. There's many copies of it.
No, and it's true. I would think, and you have and I'm not sure what the literacy rate was, but I can't imagine it's as high as a first world country today. So, I mean, cultural norms and pushing this is great because, you have no way to disprove it in literature. If you can't read.
This is true, unfortunately, and the old adage about the winners write the history. Well, the church, had nearly 2,000 years to write the history, so it's no wonder it always confirms the truth of their story, and the others don't really matter. In fact, obviously they've tried many times to marginalise it out of existence. I mean, did we know anything about the Gnostics really until they just happened to find some material in a rubbish heap in Egypt, and then now we've got a different story, we've got a different angle here, and and of course those who write for the church have to shuffle their feet and make a few concessions here and there, but that's the way it goes, isn't it? And unfortunately, wanton destruction of your enemy can be very effective. I mean, sometimes nothing is left, and there are just great big gaps in our knowledge, and maybe there'll always be.
And speaking of truth, I mean, can we determine whether Jesus was born in Bethlehem or Nazareth? Do the Gospels lead us in the right direction here?
Well, your question is, can we determine? If that means prove, there's absolutely no proof that he was born anywhere, let alone Bethlehem, Nazareth, or what have you. What can we say about that? Well, I mean, we have shrines, of course. I mean, what the Christians did and do, and certainly were able to get away with it in a major way during the Middle Ages, was simply they created a landscape to fit their story. Now, I've done some interesting stuff, just mapping out the Holy Land, and all these places where Jesus supposedly walked and healed and performed miracles and what have you. Well, the truth is, I mean, they're all later inventions. But once they've been invented, once they're on the pilgrim map, once people are going there, then you have what the church lovingly calls traditions. So once you've got a tradition established, well, that's tantamount to it making it true. And the longer the tradition has gone on, well, then surely the truer it must be, And that characterizes almost every chapter and verse of the Christian story. Where was Jesus born? The people go to extraordinary lengths to try and fit the story. I mean, it always amuses me when you get astronomers trying to prove that there was a star of some description. I mean, this is lunacy, really. The story it doesn't make any sense. Read as a story about wise men in the east seeing a star and following it to. I mean, can you follow a star from one city to another? I mean, what does extraordinary thing to do, let alone follow it to it stops over a house. I mean, the whole thing is nonsense, but people try and square the circle, don't they?
I know, but it's funny. The Gospels themselves don't agree, and that's my facetious point is that you can't garner any truth even if you do believe it.
Here we are, mythicists. None of us believe it was a real event, and we're arguing where it happened. It's a little bit absurd.
Right. And I meant to be facetious with my question that the Gospels don't agree. So, I mean, to get at truth is impossible even if you're taking the Bible because it's contradictory.
It's the Mythicist Milwaukee show. I'm going to interrupt us all for a little station break. I want to remind everyone that we are, in fact, sponsoring the long-awaited debate between mythicists Robert Price, Dr. Robert Price, and Bart Ehrman, the long-awaited debates that will take place in October. Ken, are you booked in? Are you got a ticket? Are you looking forward to that debate?
Oh, it'd be a very interesting debate for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Two of my favorite writers.
We'll make sure to keep you apprised.
Yeah, well, we do plan on, for those that live very far across a small ocean, will be able to watch this on the internet for a small, reasonable fee. Pay-per-view. Not even as expensive as a boxing match. It'll be quite affordable, and so you'll be able to see that, and we're all very excited and looking forward to that. In October. Excellent. It's 2:47 and getting late, and we're having an easy listen. As always, we can listen to the golden tones of a Ken Humphreys speak nonstop, even if he's just reading the phone book. But we do have a feature we like to call Myth of the Day, and here is our own Mythmeister himself, Antonio, with Myth of the Day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Humphreys, for being on the show with us today. I'm going to read, since we are connecting Rome to Christianity, I'll read a little bit about Romulus here. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome and the son of Marge, is born of a vestigial virgin, sworn to celibacy. His mother claims that the divine impregnated her, yet this is not believed by the king. Romulus and his twin brother Remus are tossed into the river and left for dead. Romulus is hailed as the son of God. He is snatched away to heaven by a whirlwind. It is assumed that the gods took him, and he makes post-mortem appearances. Plutarch writes, he disappeared on the nones of July, as they now call the month, which was the Quintilis, leaving nothing of certainty to be related of his death, only the time. Romulus, when he vanished, left neither the least part of his body, nor the remnant of his clothes to be seen. The senators suffered them not to search or busy themselves about the matter, but commanded them to honor and worship Romulus as one taken up to the gods. And in connection to the recent commentary question regarding the Mithraic Temple underneath the Vatican, there is a 2007 article in the New York Times titled A Mithraic Temple in the Heart of Christian Rome. It states there are many reasons to visit this basilica, if only because provides a one-stop tour of Rome's ancient past and its complex entanglement of history, politics, and religions. It then continues to say, I used to love coming as a child because of the 2nd century Mithraic temple in the belly of the basilica.
Wow.
There it is right there.
Very good. Very good.
We should update Wikipedia and all the travel things, right? If you're,
absolutely,
maybe there's some
absolutely.
Hanging out. I don't know.
We've only got about 10 minutes left, Ken. What are you working on now? What are you pushing? What's your big thing? Where can people find your fabulous work?
Okay, well, I think if people aren't aware of my website by now, well, they obviously can't read simple language. JesusNeverExisted.com is a very easily found website. It's quite massive. More recently, I've spent a lot more time on YouTube because, hell, people like the comfort zone of listening, right, and watching rather than reading, and why not? So do I. So the short videos, which I started at 5 minutes, 5-minute enlightenment, they've grown a bit. Some of the more recent ones have been about 20 minutes because people want more of this. But as you guys would know, creating these things takes quite a bit of time. So I've got many of them under wraps. One of the things I do is I start many different projects simultaneously, and then it becomes a struggle to actually get one finished and up and published. But I'll be revamping the site and reinvigorating my YouTube offerings in the new year in a major way. So something to look forward to there. Whilst we're on the subject of Jesus, though, let me share you my little anecdote about where I came close to these things in the flesh. If we look at actually Santa Claus. Now, we haven't touched upon Santa Claus, but he's an interesting part of the Jesus legend. Nobody seriously would suggest that Santa Claus has had anything to do with Jesus, although, of course, they're both nice guys, aren't they, and fond of children. But probably many people know that Santa Claus really derived from St. Nicholas. And who was St. Nicholas? Well, he was actually a real figure. There does appear to have been a bishop in the 4th century in southern Turkey, what was then ancient Greece, in Lycia, in a town called Myra. And I had the pleasure of living there for some months. And so I had access to St. Nicholas's church, and we could spend the odd afternoon there wandering around and eating my sandwiches. And it was quite cute to think, well, this is where Santa Claus began, because, it was actually quite a small building. And it's actually a very small town, at least it was at the time.
And he fits through small
Now, the
chimneys.
interesting thing about that is the Italians, or Italian pirates, so-called, came and stole the bones of St. Nicholas and took them to their own shrine in Italy, in Bari, in Italy. And so there are now competing claims from both Turkey and Italy to the bones of St. Nicholas. And his bones have even appeared in places as far afield as Ireland. So he's like most saints, his corpse proved rather more useful than his living presence. And is distributed far and wide. And it seems that somewhere along the migration of bits of St. Nicholas and bits of his story northward, he got merged with some Germanic flying holy man or god who was kind to children. And that seems to be part of how we get the man in the sky. So it's an interesting little side to the Christmas story. But it shows how humans are very fond of modifying and adapting and pillaging other people's cultural inheritance and moving it forward with their own commercial concerns. And by God, has the church done that?
I put it to a general lack of creativity. There's no new ideas. Hollywood rehashes a movie that 20 years ago, and religion's done the same thing with mythology throughout the... Absolutely.
And the sad thing is some people take it seriously. That's the thing that's objectionable.
It's true, right. And I always thought, well, why the chimney? Why not the front door if you're going to break and entering anyways? I mean, is St. Nick a chimney sweep? Was that what he did before he started bishoping?
You're saying, yeah, Santa is breaking and entering. Yeah, well, I think it began with sweets or something the equivalent of sweets, but by golly, has it grown into a big commercial festival? I mean, that's the thing about Christmas now. Really, when you talk about Christmas, it's how many people are really talking about a religious Christmas? They're talking about a commercial and family Christmas, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got a question from a listener. Chaz Baker writes, Ken, and I'm going to read this verbatim. From your great website, I see that there is also as many doubts about the 12 disciples and Paul as there are about Jesus. Would you ever consider writing a book on New Testament minimalism? When Old Testament minimalism first began some years ago, no one took it seriously. Now most secular scholars agree that Abraham, Moses, and the patriarchs are all just legend and myth, and most of the stories like Exodus, destruction of Canaanite cities, etc., are the same silly little tales. What do you say, sir? Thanks, Chaz.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that question there, because of course, I don't know how you guys find it, but the very fact now that the Jewish patriarchs are very widely in the academic world accepted as mythological, that they have lost all credibility, that these foundation stories of Israel, even most Israeli academics don't even try and insist that they were true, so that when all that goes down the tubes, or if, let's say, reality dawns, where does that leave someone who claims to be a descendant of these people? Jesus is having the ground pulled from under him, and that's a cause for some optimism on that front. The sad thing is, I have to say this. The sad thing is we have a different religion now that's threatening us more than Christianity. But there we go.
Yeah, no, that's true. But speaking of the minimalism, Jesus is often portrayed as a carpenter, but I don't see many trees growing in Israel. I mean, what can we attack, and how much is out there, and what is safe to go to? Yeah,
I lost a little bit of your dialogue there. Within Israel, I mean, obviously the opinions are split, because there is the Zionist wing, the Orthodox wing that doesn't want to give any ground, and there is an academic wing that lives with reality, and minimalism. We call it minimalism only in contrast to the fantasy tales that were believed before. Your caller there mentioned Paul. Well, I've had doubts about Paul for a long time, but I'm well ahead with a book on Paul specifically to answer some of these issues. But there are still grey areas regarding Paul. That's why I'm still holding fire on that. But in many circles, people don't any longer try. It's interesting. It still holds up for Jesus. When you see a debate on the television, at least in the UK, academics will quite happily say Moses didn't exist, Abraham didn't exist, Noah didn't exist, none of them existed. But they'll sort of they'll hedge their bets when it comes to Jesus. But that's only a matter of political correctness.
It almost sounds like, yes, my basement doesn't exist, nor does my first story, but my second story is there. It really...
Yeah, that's right. Good way of putting it. Good way of putting it.
And we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to make sure we mention Batman and Jesus, our full-length feature, which we are producing with King's Tower Productions here in the center of it all, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Batman and Jesus going to examine the Christ myth theory as it relates to modern mythologies like the Batman story. So look forward to seeing that come to fruition as the months go by. Going forward. Like us on YouTube, too. King's Tower, of course, produces Holy Shit, our short video series, which is available in smaller chunks on Facebook, but which, if you subscribe to our channel on YouTube, you can enjoy in their full, hilarious length. We've been talking to Ken Humphreys. We are really down to just a couple of minutes. Let me plug next week's guest, too, before we give it up to Ken one last time and his delicious vocal pipes. It's Foundation Beyond Belief. Next week, they are organized the first secular relief effort for disaster relief here in America recently. Rebecca Vitzman, known as the tornado atheist, who came out to Wolf Blitzer when he foolishly asked her if she thanked God for surviving a tornado in Oklahoma. I hope she's going to be on. We know that Noel George, the director, will be on. So tune in next week at our regular time for that. We've been talking to Ken Humphreys. We got about a minute and a half left. Ken, wrap it up for us. You got about a minute. Tell us something else to blow us away with your incredible mythicist knowledge, my friend.
Well, let me thank you guys, because I think you're doing a great job over there. You're putting together some a great ammunition for the secular and rational community, and you're a breath of fresh air, and I'll give you all the support I possibly can. And I've had a blast. I mean, I can talk about this Jesus guy ad infinitum. So it's been great to be on the show and to chat with you. So yeah, all the best for that. All the best for this. There's some sort of festival coming up in a week or two. I'm not sure what it is. But whatever it is, you enjoy it, right?
Festivus for the rest
Happy
of us.
Saturnalia to you.
Very good. He's Ken
Yeah,
Humphreys.
that's right. Yeah.
Stay on the line if you want. We're going to sign off. And thanks again for joining us, Ken. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And a really popular one with the listeners. We've had more interaction than normal because people really, really love your work. So keep up the great work. Thanks again. It's Ken Humphreys, and we'll see you next time on the
Mythicist
Milwaukee show. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken.